the Oxford Medieval Studies lecture for Trinity term 2021. We are thrilled to welcome Jim Harris from Oxford virtually, and we are very pleased that he will add some sparkle from the Ashmolean to us. Leslie Smith, my co-director, will introduce him in a minute. What I wanted to share with you first was a new look website we have been rescuing from the depths of the university internet archive, the Oxford Medieval Studies website, where everybody is welcome to contribute blog posts and their news, and you'll see on the right-hand side the calendar of things happening here, further down the tweets, the YouTube channel. And one thing I want to highlight before I hand over to Leslie Smith is under opportunities, the Oxford Medieval Studies small grant scheme is running until this Friday. So do get in your bids for that. With that, over to Leslie.
As Henrika said, we're enormously pleased today to welcome as this term's Oxford Medieval Studies lecturer, Jim Harris, who is the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation teaching curator at the Ashmolean Museum. The richness and depth of Oxford's collections make it particularly well placed to be at the forefront of the material turn in medieval studies, but we haven't always exploited that wealth, perhaps as much as we should have. The appointment of Jim Harris, with his skills both in art history and communication, have made an important difference, and he sets us all such a positive example. He's first of all revolutionized the way in which the museum's collections can be used in teaching, but he's also equipping the rest of us to be able to use those collections too. Jim began his career as an actor before moving as a mature student to a doctorate at the Courtauld on the polychrome sculpture of Donatello. His title today is Museum in the Middle, Medieval Things in a Medieval Museum in a Medieval University. Jim, over to you.
You're very kind. Thank you, Leslie. That was enormously generous of you. And thank you all for being here, and to Henrika for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and somewhat daunting. What I'm going to do next is that slightly awkward moment where I will share my screen and you will see things you oughtn't to see for a moment, but then all being well, all will be well. And I hope now you can just see a solitary screen on which there will be a slide with an image of a gaming board. We'll come back to the gaming board later on, but for the moment it's there because it is beautiful. It's there because it gives pleasure and it gives joy, and because these things we need. It's there also because there is in it something which, as we'll see later on, I think, ties it both forwards and backwards in time, both to whatever it was the Renaissance was looking towards and back into the history from which the Renaissance had sprung. Here's a more properly medieval object, if you like. This diptych of the Adoration of the Magi and the Crucifixion is one of those things that was separated, each part orphaned from the other at some point in its history, at some early point in its history, because we know that this was in the collection of John Tradiscant, whose collections formed the basis of the Ashmolean. In 1656, the other half now at the V&A has less interest in one sense because it has nothing left of that green stain which is in the background behind the Magi on the Ashmolean leaf. Enough about that object. I was saying it is slightly daunting to be here talking to you this evening, and it is indeed terrifying to give a lecture at which there is guaranteed to be somebody somewhere in the audience who knows more about literally every single thing I am going to show you and say than I do. Nonetheless, I'd like to thank Henrika for inviting me, to Leslie for introducing me, and to all of you for showing up. Of course, the Ashmolean, contrary to my title, is not really a medieval museum. But this is definitely a medieval university. Nowhere that pays using the systems that this university does, employs using the contracts that this university does, and atomizes its membership as this university does, could be anything but medieval. And I am not really, like the museum itself, a medievalist, whatever that is, strictly speaking. And sometimes I fear for medievalists. There's a tendency, I think, for periodization, like pop, to eat itself. The long 18th century, for example, seems sometimes still to be going on. The early modern is gradually consuming the Renaissance and looking hungrily back towards late antiquity, which in turn is licking its lips as it rampages past the first millennium of the Common Era. In other words, where the medieval fits in all that is itself sometimes tricky to understand. However, as long as there are arguments to be made for this brooch and this great hall at Lambeth Palace both to be in some way medieval, then I think that medieval and all of you can pretty much look after yourselves. Much of the teaching it's been my pleasure and privilege to undertake at the Ashmolean has been rooted in our medieval collections. There are any number of reasons for this. Straightforwardly, the first person I called when I got to Oxford 9 years ago was a medievalist. Our medieval collections are strong, and more to the point, they're full of old bits and pieces which the curators and conservators in their generosity have been happy to have handled and examined by myself and by my students. I used to think that medievalists liked the museum because the more the documents dried up, the more people needed objects to look at. But that was before I really knew many medievalists and their many documents. What I've come to realize, though, is that there is among medievalists a strong thread connecting them to the past of their study. And it's a thread that might be brought under the banner of wonder, a recognition that there is benefit and understanding and knowledge even to be derived from looking at things that we do not know and do not understand, from exploring their mysteries, not simply because we expect to unpick them all, but because they are mysteries. Things that require us to learn new languages of looking and ordering in order to take in what we see. This is not an early modern or Enlightenment exercise. This is not something that can be claimed by a later period, this business of looking carefully in order to understand. This is a human business. What the early modern and the Enlightenment have done to it, though, is to make us imagine that it is valuable only for its output. What I'd like to do this evening is to think first about how putting wonder into the curriculum contributes to that curriculum, to learning within it and without it, irrespective of output. I think that being with objects help us learn in ways that go beyond the answer to any particular examination question, but that will help us with any particular examination question. And I'd like to think briefly about the business of how the business of looking at objects binds us to a past of looking, to a long history of looking, and how something about that past binds it to us. Sadly, in our look at some of the collections this evening, there won't be much of this kind of thing. These are pretty much the fanciest objects that I've taught with. The aim is not, I'm sad to say, to trawl collection highlights, and at that I can hear the lights going out all over Europe, or at least the Zoom connections being switched off. What we're actually going to thinking about are things like this and other unprepossessing bits of lead. But these are the things that I use in teaching. And with a few honourable exceptions, they are like these, mostly small and grey or brown and broken. However, One of the purposes of teaching with objects is not to be an art historian, to introduce students to wonderful things, to give them Howard Carter at the tomb of Tutankhamun moment. It's actually to think about the everyday and the mundane, the broken and the battered, the fragmented and the fractured, because it's in those things that we see and begin to understand the real lives of people who have held these things, who have put them in their pockets, who have used them, who have discarded them. Why people did that, what they did in doing that. These are some of the questions at issue when we teach with objects like this. This is a work, this kind of understanding that is at least as much medieval as it is modern. I said that the first person I called when I got to Oxford was a medievalist, and I will name that person. It was Annie Sutherland of Somerville College. And it was as a result of that call that I began to explore the collections with a view to teaching. I put together, at Annie's behest, a group of Anglo-Saxon / Norse / early English metalwork. This was a group of objects that was good for lots of things. First of all, perhaps, and still very usefully, for deconstructing the monolithic idea of what it meant to be Anglo-Saxon. Because from the 5th to the 9th or 10th century in these islands, Anglo-Saxon was only a part of any other number of competing and interlocking identities. Anglian, Frankish, Swedish, Saxon, Danish, all of them moving alongside each other, fighting each other, killing each other, agreeing with each other sometimes and settling down together. Anglo-Saxon is a model of medieval diversity, if you like. So these objects on your screen now, I haven't given them any scale. I haven't told you what they are. I haven't told you how much they weigh. All you have is the image of them. This is a deliberate strategy, because when we bring students into the study room in the museum, we don't give them an object list. We don't give them a crib for the things that they're going to look at. We give them the encounter with the object and ask that they dwell on that, because in that will be the answers to the questions about these objects. What can they tell us about themselves, rather than what do we need to be told about them? How do they work? How were they made? What are they made of? What do they mean? These questions of meaning are also medieval questions as well as modern ones. And that's the point of being in the room with the objects. So how do we work with them? How does that process unfold in a classroom with objects like this? From my own pedagogical point of view, that process began with this object. As you can see, it's by an unknown sculptor. It's an image of Darth Vader in plastic, paper, and polychromy with an electronic interior, which enables Darth to speak to you. The reason he's here is because in a class on sculpture and text at the Courtauld Institute many years ago, I wanted my students to look carefully at some images on the screen without being distracted by anything else that they might already know about the object. So I brought this in, I put it on the table, and I asked each of the students present to say one thing about the object. It's an interesting exercise. The first time I did this, there were 10 students in the room, and as we went round and each student observed one thing, and I was very strict with that, we got to the 10th person and none of them had told me what colour it was. Our capacity to talk about things without seeing the most obvious is one of the things that restrains us and constrains us when we're looking at objects. This then has been the principle by which I've begun to work with students and objects since I've been in Oxford, to give them one thing, to invite each student to say one thing about the one thing, and gradually, therefore, to build up a picture which is shared between the group. The sharing between the group is an important part of the process. If we allow one person to say more than one thing, then what we do is we continue those privileges that some students bring with them to the university. That is to say, the privilege of having a voice which they have been told is worth listening to. And that voice sometimes can be a dominant one in the room. By constraining the amount anyone is allowed to say, everybody is allowed to say something, even those whose voices are shy and those whose voices have been taught only to repeat what they've already been told. This is an important part of the process because it makes of the object study room an inclusive space. It makes of the object study room a democratic space, which may seem a grand claim for a group of students sat at a table in the Ashmolean looking at a girdle hanger. But actually, what it does is it enables everybody to own not only the object, but the process of understanding it. The way it works with the girdle hanger is remarkable. The observations of the first 4 people will always leave the last 3 people worrying that there will be nothing left to say. And yet it's possible sometimes to go around the room 2 or 3 times before observation is exhausted. With those observations, it's then possible to do other exercises, to ask the students to describe the tools that were used necessarily to make this object, to think about the processes that went into its manufacture, to think about the team of people that might have been necessary to produce a small copper alloy thing in the 6th century. These questions are only answerable after you've looked as closely as you can. These are questions which are also at issue if we step forward into a later period, the English language and literature paper in later medieval literature, which spans, broadly speaking, the period from about 1350 to 1550, is also one which is usefully fed by the medieval collections at the Ashmolean. Because when we bring together things which, in this instance, all have religious significance, the questions are not limited by that aspect of their meaning which might gather them together on display in the museum. We take them off display, or we take them out of the storeroom, and they become objects capable of answering many more questions than those which we are able to share within the limitations of a museum label. So it's not the religious significance of these things alone which we're able to address. We're able to think about them as objects which are both ordinary and extraordinary. Questions of identity might be raised by looking at the Pilgrim Badge, John Shawn there, a local holy man to the Thames Valley, and then above it, the personal seal of the prior of the Carmelite Priory of Oxford. Identity at 2 different levels, the belonging to a cult, which goes with wearing a Pilgrim Badge, and the membership in a powerful order, the order whose precincts and premises were on the site where the Ashmolean now stands. So that is an object which takes us in a material and enormously immediate way back into the world of pre-modern Oxford. We can think about industry and its products, the way in which a living might be earned from manufacture by looking at the mold on the left, which was able to produce tokens with the face of John the Baptist and his name around the edge. John the Baptist literally presented on a platter for the owner of that token, and his name in the vocative case calling out all the time, Sancta Johannes Baptista, beginning the prayer of the pilgrim. We see this thing capable of producing any number of tiny, thin, vanishingly thin little lead tokens. We can think both about the person making the tokens, the skill that went into the manufacture of the mold, which is a marvel in itself, and the needs of the pilgrim, the person for whom a token speaking out its prayer in their pouch or their pocket is seeking protection on their way home from Amiens, which is the point of origin of this object. And then we can think about other things. We can think about the destruction of objects, their loss, not just their losses from having been discarded, like the Pilgrim Badge, but they're losses from having been deliberately broken, like this torso from an English corpus of the early 15th century, which has been broken. The feet have been bent down, and the nail hole, which you can see at the bottom there, the half a nail hole, indicates that it's been ripped from its fixings, its arms broken off. But that act of violence done to that corpus has its outworking in another act, because the stumps of the arms are worn smooth, not by filing and not by having been cut, but worn smooth by touch. And it seems that this little corpus has had an afterlife as another devotional object, apart from the crucifix on which it once hung. Once we start asking these questions about these medieval objects, they stimulate questions about the medieval world. The world in which these things operated becomes more accessible, more visible. It also becomes a world in which modern people live, strangely. This alabaster, made somewhere in the middle of England, we call these things Nottingham Alabasters, as you know, on account of the fact that that great concentration of alabaster at the point where Derbyshire and Staffordshire and Nottinghamshire meet led to an industry in their production, these standard size, portrait format, narrative reliefs, which could be built up into altarpieces and which found their way into thousands of English parish churches, as well as being exported across the continent. This one, which has traces of its polychromy in place, traces of its gilding still in place, depicts the martyrdom of St. Bartholomew, one of the most appalling of the martyrdom stories of Christ's apostles. It's a difficult object to look at. It's difficult because it's skillful, and its skill lies not in being a brilliant piece of sculpture. As Leslie pointed out earlier on, I wrote my PhD on Donatello, and my standards for sculpture are, as a result, pretty high. This is not great sculpture, but what it is extraordinarily legible. Every detail of the flaying of Bartholomew is there to be seen. It's an object which necessarily, when dealing with students, comes with a warning, because it is so visceral. But it's also a modern object. Made in the 1420s, it shows people from the 1420s in dress of the 1420s, taking the place of the Armenians who martyred Bartholomew, the servants of the king who took against him. This is an object meant to be seen and meant to be a reminder of the potential in the people next to you, the people around you in the church, the people in your village, to do terrible things, and the need not to do them. The modernity, the contemporaneity of this object reminds us that the medieval may be medieval to us, but the medieval was now, and every object we're looking at is a modern object. Every object that we're looking at also has the same capacity as every other object, which is to say it possesses enormous agility. I would define the quality of agility in an object as its capacity to submit to interrogation from any number of disciplinary standpoints. Any person from pretty well any discipline can be interested in the same object. They will ask different questions of it, and as a result, it may give them different answers. Nonetheless, the object can recenter itself under any kind of gaze. This little pyx, this container for the host, a parish church, a local size container for the host, is, in terms of my teaching, the single greatest object in the entire museum. I've worked with this object again and again. It tells you a great deal about itself just by looking. It tells you a great deal more about itself than does, for example, our other Limoges pyx of approximately the same date, which is on display in the galleries. It's on display because it is shiny and golden, because its enamel is intact, because it is a beautiful thing. but in being a beautiful thing, it has lost some of the things which the little pyx on the right has gained from touch and use and damage and immersion in water and breakage, from possession in different hands, and from being gradually passed into the care of the museum. The pyx on the right is an agile object par excellence. It's an agile object because we can look inside it and we can see what's happened to it, because we can hold its lid and feel how the copper alloy has been cut into. We can see how the enamel has broken out from its champ-levé surroundings. We can see how the copper has leached through the gilding on the interior. And we can see how the gilding too has been scratched by something moving in and out and in and out of the box over a very long period of time. So what can we talk about when we look at an object like this? Well, we can talk about the obvious things that medievalists might be most interested in: the iconography, its place in devotional practice as a liturgical object, its immediate function for containing the body of Christ. We can think about it in stylistic terms and connect it with other products of the Limoges production of the same period. However, we can do a lot more than that. It may be that we would do a class on this in which we thought only about its physical history, its technique, its materials, its manufacture, and therefore its value then and now. Or we could put together a class where we would talk about this as either a mass or serial production, again about its manufacture and its technique, but also about the trade routes that it embodies, the trade in raw materials and the trade in the object itself as it was exported from Limoges and found its way to wherever it was going. Those questions feed back into the question of its value as an agglomeration of raw materials, its value as a manufactured thing, and its value as an essential part of the liturgical apparatus of a church. These conversations, joining up these various points of interest, are not the exclusive possession of any one discipline or other. Even the question of what this thing is made of, and there are so many things that it's made of: copper, gold, glass, cobalt, metallic mercury, tin, iron sulfate, alum, lead, cinnabar, zinc, wood. All of these things ask questions related to that network we saw on the last slide. Where did they come from? How much did they cost? Who worked with the different components in order to make the whole object? In what order did they work? What's necessary about heating an object which enables it to be gilded, for example? That's different from the necessary heating that goes with enameling. So who does care about the little pyx, apart from me? I would like to say everybody cares about the little pyx, because everybody should care about the little pyx. But these are some of the people with whom I've worked on the little pyx over the last several years, with neuroscientists, with art historians, theologians, classicists, psychiatrists, with historians of science and medicine, and with a general practitioner and his students, with people from the business school, Italianists, geographers, historians, with people in the study of English literature. Each time the thing comes out, different questions are asked, different observations are made. And this is a medieval object which brings itself so thoroughly into our world by virtue of its long history, by virtue of the damage it has sustained, and by virtue of the eloquence of those things, that medieval or not, all of these different kinds of scholar are able to put it to work. This Pilgrim Badge, which we looked at earlier, of John Shawn, and this holy water ampulla are likewise agile in different ways. And these were most recently brought into the service of an MST module, which I teach with Annie Sutherland on devotional texts and material culture, circa 1200 to 1500. It's one of those course titles that you can imagine leaping out as a student from the curriculum, making them immediately say, yes, that's what I want to do. There are, in fact, snappier titles for the individual components of the course, including one which is called Travelling and Staying Put, in which we think about those aspects of devotional practice in medieval England which were to do with pilgrimage, but also to do with the extreme staying put of the anchorite or the anchoritess. It's a kind of Marjorie Kemp versus Julian of Norwich standoff that week. Now, it may feel like we've all been Julian of Norwich most of the past year, but one of the joys really of the museum is its capacity to do what we want to do in these times, which is to turn us all into Marjorie Kemp, such that we can travel. And we can travel vicariously through the objects, just as people travelled vicariously through the writings of someone like John Mandeville. This aspect of medieval experience in which things happened because people told us stories, not because we were actually able to go to Canterbury or Aniel or even to North Marston in Buckinghamshire, where John Shaw's well and shrine were. This vicarious experience that medieval objects allowed at the time that they were made and allow us now was at the heart of the collecting project of the man whose collections shaped not only the museum, but the man who gave his name to the museum, Elias Ashmole, his predecessor, and the person who acquired his collections by fair means or foul, I'm not getting into that argument now, was John Tradiscant. And here he is in all his magnificence. John Tradiscant was, amongst other things, keeper of the king's silkworms at Oakland's Palace. And who wouldn't want to be that? I suppose people who don't like caterpillars. But John Tradiscant was at home with a caterpillar as he was at home with more or less anything else he could lay his hands on. As a plantsman to the king and to other members of the English higher aristocracy, including the Duke of Buckingham, he travelled widely. He made his way around more or less the known world, he and his son, John Jr. They collected as they went. They saw things that interested them and they brought them home. And not only that, but they sent people off to collect, not only on their own behalf, but on behalf of their patrons. To be able to compass the world in a house, to be able to bring to their home in South Lambeth things that would show them the world was a piece of vicarious travelling in the medieval sense for all those who went to see them, and many people did go and see them. In 1634, one visitor described the Tradiscant's collection in South Lambeth as a place where a man might in one day behold and collect into one place more curiosities than he should see if he spent all his life in travel. The catalogue that was made of the Tradiscant's collection in 1656, although not always accurate, tells us something about how carefully they looked at these things, how much they wanted to know. The Tartarian saddle with its stirrups of wood and its hollow, wherein he keeps his meat always warm. And indeed, if you stuck a piece of meat in the saddle of your horse and rode across the steppes of Tartary all day, I'm fairly sure it would be warm at the end of the day. The wooden cradle drain, something which they didn't understand. And so they wrote down what they thought it was. Something to give a child a drink when wrapped in swaddling in its cradle, when in fact it's operating at the other end of the proceedings to drain the cradle for the child as it lies there swaddled. They didn't know what this rattan buckler was, this shield from the Spice Islands, thinking it to be a target. Whether they knew or not what the things were that they had, the point was that gathering them together enabled them to see something, enabled them to maintain those travels, enabled their visitors to travel with them. Those travelers' tales had made their way into visual culture in all kinds of ways. This engraving by Lucas van Leyden of the story of Muhammad and the monk Sergius is a case in point. Here is an illustration which Lucas devises, having seen a German translation of the travels of John Mandeville. Muhammad comes out of the story much better than Sergius does. The monk is the bad man in the story. Mandeville's travels were accessible by copying and later by printing, by translation and by illustration. They became things not only to read, but to look at. There is in Mandeville's travels and in the travels of other medieval adventurers much that would have spoken to the Tradiscants. Mandeville and Brother Oderic's two-headed geese, their Irish trees that produced great birds, their griffins, their giant ants and their piles of gold, their dog-headed people. These occupied a world which was not a world that the Tradiscants were seeking to disprove, but a world that they wanted to know more about. So Tradiscant collected things like this rhinoceros horn cup, a warthog skull, a dried seahorse, a silver locket containing a kidney stone, ocelot teeth. In 1625, Tradiscant sought rarities on behalf of the Duke of Buckingham, writing a letter to ship's captains of the Guinea Company and the Gold Coast Company, asking them that the things desired from those parts be these: an elephant's head with the teeth in it very large, a sea cow's head, the biggest that can be gotten, of all the strange sorts of fowls and birds, skins and beaks, legs and feathers that be rare or not known to us, all sorts of strange fishes' skins of those parts, the greatest sorts of shellfishes, shells of great flying fishes and sucking fishes, with whatever else strange. This desire for strangeness was at the heart of Tradiscant's collecting policy, and it was the same desire for strangeness that drew people fascinated again and again to stories like Mandeville's. One way of looking at all this, of course, is that what the Tradiscants and Ashmole were interested in was the creation of knowledge from their collections. And there is something in that. The first keeper of the Ashmolean, Robert Plott, was a chemist, and he lectured 3 times a week in the new museum that was built in response to Ashmole's gift of his collections in 1677. In the basement of that building, there was an experimental laboratory. The stars could be watched from the roof. But this kind of acquisition of knowledge, this generation of knowledge from objects, was not in and of itself a modern thing. This was something, as the Ordered Universe project has beautifully and wonderfully shown over the last several years, this gathering of knowledge on the basis of observation and experiment, as typified by Robert Grosseteste, was itself a medieval pursuit, one that is now being used to pursue contemporary science. In other words, the project of using objects, using a collection for knowledge generation, was not itself a modern thing. Gathering strangeness and then seeing what you could do with it, this was a medieval thing. The past is never as far away as we think it is as well. And so it wasn't for Tradiscant and for Ashmole. This, perhaps the dullest picture in the entire museum, is of John Lowen. John Lowen, given to us as an unimpeachably dull English Puritan gentleman of circa 1640. But John Lowen was also an actor who worked with Henslowe and Marlowe and Alleyn at the Rose Theatre, with Shakespeare and Burbage and Ben Jonson at the Globe. He was Iago to Richard Burbage's Othello. The year he was born, 1576, was only 9 years after the opening of the first ever permanent theatre in London, John Brayne's Red Lion at Whitechapel. And long after he'd become a successful leading actor in the first decade of the 17th century, Lowen was still taking part in a pageant for the Goldsmiths Company to celebrate the appointment of one of their number as Lord Mayor. His world, Lowen's world, was a world of mystery plays and livery companies, a world of guilds, a world of medieval structures and medieval forms of membership. And Lowen's world was also the world of Tradiscant and Ashmole. The kinds of past that the Ashmolean has gathered to itself and kept close have not all been alike. These two objects may seem very different. This portrait of Arthur Evans sitting in some fictive version of the Palace of Knossos in Crete, surrounded by the objects of the Minoan culture he named, was the son of John Evans, a collector of English archaeology, amongst other things. Evans' collection came to the Ashmolean through the gift of Arthur in 1909. And it's astonishing how many of the objects that we look at in those early medieval classes have 1909 accession numbers, having been gathered together by John Evans in the 19th century. These are one family with two pasts that they were interested in. Another was the past as typified and personified by this man, C.D.E. Fortnum, seen here as the collector at home, surrounded by the things that he loved, most especially the Medici porcelain vase that he has in his hand, which is now on display just almost alongside the portrait in a touching juxtaposition. This collector gathered all kinds of objects, from finger rings to bronzes to paintings to drawings, and gave them to the museum in the 1880s and 1890s. These collectors are part of the way in which the Ashmolean has grown, not by acquisition of individual things largely, but by the bringing together of similarly interested people, by the bringing together of people who wanted to know the world through the things that people produced in it. Of course, what we want to do with those things now is share them as widely as we can, and the business of listing them and describing them is one of our principal works at the present time. Collections digitization, the most modern thing we could possibly do, and over 200,000 records are now available to search in our online collection. I am delighted to say, and it is an enormous credit to the digitization team, that over the last several years they've transformed our online offering from one of the feeblest to one of the finest. Of course, when we look at the collections, we do so through our own database, and the database is even more extensive. Here I just put in the word print to see what would turn up, and 150,037 things are already there in the database to be found, searched. This colossal work of categorization and listing and describing, even this modern iteration of it, is not new. This is the reverse of the diptych leaf we saw earlier on, partnered with its former colleague now at the V&A. And this is what the back looks like. And the back records how we've seen this thing, where it's been. In the Tradiscant's collection in 1656, in the first catalogue of the Ashmolean in 1685, in the next catalogue in 1756. Its status as an art treasure is underlined in the exhibition of 1857, and its national importance underlined in its loan to the National Exhibition in Leeds in 1868. We trace the story of the object on the object. This kind of recording, this kind of notation, this is not modern. The keeping of lists, the making of inventories, the recording of what was possessed, where it came from, who had given it, what it was made of, what it looked like. These were questions of interest to, in particular, King Charles V of France and his brothers, Jean de Berry and Louis of Anjou. Philip of Burgundy was too busy doing other things to have an inventory made during his lifetime. But Jean de Berry's, Louis of Anjou's and Charles V's are colossal objects. They are not dissimilar in that respect from our digital archive. Louis of Anjou's 8-kilogram book of belongings, which runs to 3,600 items across 900 folios, is a vast work of looking carefully and recording what is seen. Pretty well everything that was in Louis's inventory is lost to us. Nonetheless, such things as we are able to read about in his inventory are astounding. The great crown that Louis possessed has an inventory listing which runs to over 30 folios. Those folios are densely written. Every stone, every piece of gold is measured and weighed and described. Every aspect of the crown is given to you in writing, such that that catalogue would work as a modern museum digital record if it were not so long. Louis and Jean de Berry and Charles V all did far more than we are able to do in inventorying our collections now. They shared an interest in things that the Tradiscants were interested in too. If we go back to these things, then we can think about the way in which Louis of Anjou, for example, used the word strange, or Jean de Berry used the word strange, sometimes referring to things which are exotic and foreign, in other contexts to things which are to do with the natural world, sometimes to do with stones, with gems. Jean de Berry's inventory, in which strange things are jewels of unusual colour or size or shape, to do with the forms of beasts and leaves and birds. These are the same strange things that John Tradiscant sent the sea captains off to find for him. Strange stones, strange shapes, strange beasts. This is the first page of that description of Louis of Anjou's crown, 39 folios. The first attempt to transcribe Louis's inventory by Morinville over a century ago gave up after 3 lines of this description and then went on to say, it goes on for a long time. This business of describing that we share with those Valois kings is something which is a useful tool in teaching in the museum. These are images of a class in which 50-year medical students on their neurological rotation come to the museum, and we give them objects that they know nothing about and ask them to describe them. We ask them to describe them and to write a description, much as Louis wrote descriptions of his objects. And then we ask them to read the description out to their colleagues in order that they might try to draw the object. Part of the purpose of this is to emphasize the need for a shared and common language of description, a shared visual vocabulary, which will be useful to them in describing the kinds of complex images with which neuroscience now proceeds. But part of it also is simply to let them understand how complex a simple thing can apparently be. It's a tough game to ask them to do, and they come out of it full of wonder, both at the difficulty and at the objects themselves. So, the Ashmolean as a medieval museum does many things. One of the pleasantest teaching experiences I've had in the Ashmolean was one, though, where I wasn't actually teaching. So I was able to look. I was fetching and carrying for Henrika and Edmund Wareham, looking at, among other things, some illustrations from the Nuremberg Chronicle. I love these illustrations. Here is a book which was conceived to include a history that included the everyday, people falling from a collapsing bridge in Utrecht, and also the miraculous. Here, Elijah and the chariot of fire. These two things brought together in one story, the recent and the ancient, the factual and the mythical, represents a holistic view of everything that the world has to offer. Its narrative, its story, its things. And this is a view which the museum, I think, to some extent embodies. This is not to say we are a universal museum, because we are not. Our collections don't cover the entire globe. They cover essentially those parts of the globe which Tradiscant was able to reach out to. So North Africa, the Levant, South Asia, East Asia, the east coast of the Americas, Western Europe. But these little illustrations, hacked out of their books, embody something which is about the whole world, or at least about as much of the world as Tradiscant, or in this case, Voldemort and Pladenwolf, were able to know. The tragedy and the interest of the collectors, Francis Dowse, people like that, who hacked books about to get the illustrations out, even that is of interest to us in the museum, because there is a medieval practice, the destruction of the things that we love. Those three objects remaining from Louis of Anjou's inventory remain to us because the rest of those things were destroyed in order to fund Louis's campaigns, amongst other things. Nonetheless, the colossal devotion to his objects that Louis displayed in his inventory, the vast interest in every kind of history that is present in the Nuremberg Chronicle, suggests that the medieval mind is a mind that is encompassing, a mind that is in itself a museum. And this, I think, is what the museum must continue to be. We displayed the year before last this tremendous painting by A.R. Pegg, the East German artist who came to the West before the collapse of the Berlin Wall. It's the largest painting that's ever been on display in the Ashmolean, over 3 meters high and almost 10 meters wide. The challenge of hanging it and displaying it was an enormous one. And to bring it to the museum, to work out that challenge, to hang it, was a medieval process. It was a process that brings us in line with Louis of Anjou himself, as he commissioned and then sought to display the Ange Apocalypse tapestries, that vast piece of tapestry work, which, when its registers are shown together, is over 5.5 meters high and hundreds of meters long. This is the tradition in which the Ashmolean should operate, a tradition which is encompassing of scale and grandeur, as well as of the tiny and the insignificant. A vision which is of the whole world, not just part of it, a vision which is big and which is wildly exciting. But medieval is in the middle of all that. The medieval is there looking backwards and looking forwards. The medieval is there. Even in the Renaissance, this might be thought of as a Renaissance object par excellence. It strives to be modern. It's neat and compact and folds. It's tidy. It might have been designed by Jonathan Ive for Apple. And yet here we are with backgammon and its 5,000 years of history, with chess and its millennium before it was finally codified in the 15th century, with the dragon game, and who the hell knows what the dragon game is all about. I hope that one of you does. We've lost the dragon game. So even this This wonderfully, miraculously complete thing is still an object of loss, an object of mystery. Loss and mystery, as well as knowing and the generation of knowledge, are at the heart of the collecting project of the Ashmolean, of its founders, are at the heart of the study of medieval history, because it's looking through the gaps, through the losses, through the destruction, that we catch glimpses of what remains. The medieval roots us and reminds us of all that we have been and all that we don't yet know, and perhaps, in the case of the Dragon game, that we may never know. And that middle age between what happened in the past and what will happen in the future is the contemporary world. It's still going on. It's everything between that and that. The past, the present, and the future. The present is the medieval. It's what reminds us to wonder. It's what fills us with the daily joy of what might be, as well as what has been. It reminds us that the world is still strange. And it reminds us that no matter how much knowledge we generate and how we transmit it in teaching, how much stuff we acquire, we may not yet or ever know quite as much as we think we do. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Jim. That was fascinating and redefining for us what medieval is in such a positive sense, gives us courage for the future and times when we'll be able to wander again together over the marvels of the Ashmolean.
I look forward to it very much. Yeah. I really do.
How we are going to operate now the question and answer session is, I see people have started putting in questions to the chat on the YouTube channel, so you're welcome to keep posting questions there, and we'll relay them to Jim. And you're also welcome to post questions on social media, tagging in Oxford Medieval Studies. I'll just start perhaps reading out one of the questions. Tom, can you post the next one? Oh, there they are already. So I see Thomas copying over the question, so I'll hand over to Leslie, who has unmuted herself, to ask the first question.
Thank you.
Jim, before I do that, I can't resist asking you a question of my own, because last week I was on a panel at the new Centre for Intellectual History, and we were talking about the importance of close reading. Yeah. And all through your wonderful lecture, I was struck by the idea of close looking. Yeah. My father-in-law was a child in the war, and his family were very interested in art, and they went to the National Gallery once a month, because at the National Gallery, where most things had been sent for safekeeping, once a month they had one picture. And he and his father would sit for an hour at a time and look at one picture. He became a professor of art history, as you might imagine. And I think today, when we can see, indeed are almost forced to see, many, many things every hour, every day, how we regain that capacity for close seeing.
That's a very good question. It's a hard one. I would love to rush to the answer that it's discipline that we require. But since I'm the single most undisciplined person in recorded history, I think that would be unfair of me to lay discipline on everybody else. I think what we do is we make pleasure of it. I was taught to look closely at one thing, first of all, by an artist, by a friend who's actually now a clergyman, who made things, not just pictures, but sculpture, all kinds of things, and who first suggested to me that we go into the National Gallery for 20 minutes and look at one thing, and it was the wooden diptych. So I was brought to the idea of it by somebody for whom looking closely was not about apprehending the complete object, but about manufacturing the thing. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it, because one of the, I think, things that holds us back from real close looking is that sense that what we need to understand is the content of an object, by which I mean the marks on its surface, the iconography of the image, the text. Whereas in fact, there is great liberation in looking at an object for every other reason but its content. To look at the size and the shape of it, to look at the front and the back of it, to see whether it's stuck to the wall with screws or nails or a hook, to see how it operates in the space around it. In other words, to think about the object qua object rather than qua bearer of image. And I think that that liberates people who aren't interested to look at things that they think they're not interested in. And when you started like that, then coming to the content of the image or of the decoration, coming to style and questions of authorship seem less daunting, because by the time you've looked at all those other things, by the time you know something about how something was made and what it was made of, you own that object. And so I think this is absolutely in keeping with what I've learned from my students and my colleagues in the museum as I've watched them look, that the process of close looking depends on being given the thing to look at and being allowed to look at it over time. Very often we're just constrained not by our own desire or our own time, but by the time of other people's. Images flash up on the screen. I've gone far too fast through far too many images today and not let you dwell on them. So I'm at fault here as well. But what I learned from my students is that the more time that I give them, the more time they will take, and that it's a learned process like everything else.
Thank you very much. I'll start by passing on a question from Anna Bowles-Rowland, who says, brilliant talk, Jim. Do you see a future of including extinct objects from things like documentary archaeology in museum collections? And if so, how?
When you say extinct objects, can I ask Anna to unpick that slightly for me? I'm not an archaeologist. When you say an extinct object, what exactly are we talking about? Or somebody else can just chip in with an answer to that question.
If I can just jump in, I think the question was probably about the number of items you showed that we have records of these items, we know they existed, but we don't have them.
Okay, non-existent things.
What can we do with those?
Like Louis of Anjou's inventory. Well, I think that we can do an enormous amount with them. If we take the inventories as an example, the work that Professor Susie Nash at the Courtauld is undertaking, even as we speak at the moment, examining those inventories, is proving to be enormously rich in its outputs. And she'll be publishing one article about the inventory of Charles V quite soon. So watch out for that. The inventories and their extinct objects enable an understanding of not just the things themselves, but the ways in which they were seen, the relationships they had to the people who gave them, who received them, who collected and itemized them. So they are not just the possessions of Jean de Berry or Charles V or Louis of Anjou, but they are societal things because they reflect something of their relational interactions. If you look at Jean de Berry's inventories, for example, the number of people that he mentions who go beyond his court, who travel from Lucca or wherever else to bring him things, who receive gifts from him and who give gifts from him, none of which we still have, we can still say something about these relationships because of the records of the objects. So I think that there is an important place to play in the writing of history by extinct objects. And I think increasingly, as museums deal with absent objects, we will have to learn how to do that, how to put them to work, because one of the challenges obviously facing museums is that things which we have got used to owning will no longer be owned by us. Those possessions which we've come into in recent centuries particularly are in some part going to have to go back, and we will need to deal with that lack in our collections, just as we deal with the lack of things still existing from those medieval inventories. And the digital world enables us to do that in a remarkable and wonderful way. But absence will also enable us to say different things about those objects and different things about the things that remain to us. because none of them exists in a vacuum.
Perhaps to follow on from that, because I was fascinated by your starting with a diptych that you digitally reunited from two collections. So would you also see a chance in digital reconstruction of lost objects? Because it would be fascinating now to go to a list like the one you showed and try to fill in gaps and
Yes.
think,
Yeah.
How we put together the remaining tiles around the Tristan tile in the Ashmolean when we're co-teaching.
This, yes, this business of reconstruction is interesting. I think it works in a number of ways. I think that the reconstructive business of digital imaging is one thing. That is to say, we can imagine things into existence in 2 dimensions. Imagining things into existence in 3 dimensions is more complex. I would say it's almost impossible to imagine into existence some of the things that Louis describes in his inventory. But we can now, given access to images of one thing, reproduce it in 3 dimensions. And those kinds of reproduction, I think, do have a place in the world of understanding and the world of engagement with objects. It's a very different place from the thing itself. One of the enormous privileges of being at the Ashmolean to do this kind of work is that there is a vast body of material which we can get our hands on, which we can touch, which we can handle. And the experience of handling a copper alloy object is different from handling a 3D printed resin object. And I think that to handle a 3D printed resin object is not helpful in understanding the object, actually, any more than a 2-dimensional image is. Except insofar as we can feel its dimensions. The materiality of it is too different. Once you go beyond that kind of difference in materiality into other kinds of reproduction in which the materials themselves are represented, then you're in a very difficult world of reproduction and, dare I say it, faking. And the reproduction is never the same thing. Anyone who's been to the baptistry in Florence in recent years, particularly to look at the north doors, Ghiberti's first set of doors, which have now been replaced by modern casts, will know that the experience of the modern cast is entirely unlike the experience of Ghiberti's originals. So I think that there is great potential in that, and I think there is a word of caution in imagining that we will understand things in the same way.
And moving on to yet another level of representation. Rebecca,
there's another one?
Yes. Well, Rebecca Menmuro would like to ask, have you found the experience of teaching with objects online? And do you have any pedagogical tips?
Yeah, don't do it. It's teaching with objects online is essentially teaching with images online, unless you can do something with the object which can then be transmitted. And that's been difficult because the museum's been actually closed for so long. What I've discovered about teaching with objects online is that if you want to teach with an object online, get as many images of it as you can and work your way around and through the object much as you would do if it were on the table in front of you. And give as much time to each object as you can. So don't do what I've just done in this lecture, but dwell on an object in just the same way you would in the study room. In other words, translate that part of the practice which is about breathing room and which is about multiple views. Translate that into 2 dimensions as much as you can, because people will notice things on the 5th image that they didn't notice on the 1st. And then they'll ask you to go back. And then you begin to engender the kind of experience that you might have in the study room. So it can be done, but it is dependent on resource. And if your resource is a single image from a museum website, then that's very difficult to do. In those circumstances, all you have is time. And if the image is of sufficient resolution, then to go in closely and to take advantage of the one thing that the live experience cannot do, which is the shared experience of looking more closely than the naked eye can manage at a detail on an object. And that has been a remarkably rewarding part of being online. That moment of sharing something which otherwise only one person at a time could notice. So, you know, having said don't do it, of course there are advantages to it. And there are, I think, principles to stick to with online object teaching, which are not dissimilar from live object teaching.
Jim, there's a very interesting question from Catherine Waldron, who again thanks you for a wonderful talk, but she wonders whether the Ashmolean will put more fractured objects, such as the little picks that you talked about so beguilingly, on show. Does the museum have to have things that are perfect, as it were, or would it be really useful to show things that are broken?
Next time you're in the museum, look carefully at everything, because everything is broken. Everything is broken, everything is remade, everything is changed, everything is transformed. And I really mean that. There's very little in the museum that is as it should be. There was a moment we had on display a quite substantial Francis Bacon oil, and in the care of another institution, the glass in the frame had been set too close to the surface and had compressed the oil of Francis Bacon's painting. So damage is still happening. It is conservable, and we have an absolutely extraordinary conservation team. But their job is not to obfuscate and not to disguise, but to make it possible to get a sense of the whole, whilst acknowledging that it might not all be there. So everything is damaged. However, I think that that's part of the joy of being in the museum, is to spot where that is. If you look in our principal painting gallery, the Fox Strangways gallery at the Tintoretto Resurrection, and you stand with the light falling in a particular way on the canvas, you can see the stitching by which the extra pieces of canvas have been added to change it from a ceiling panel intended for an octagonal spot into a big square picture. So I would say that these imperfections, these fragmentary things, they're already there. And if you look for them, then the reward is in understanding more about the object than we will tell you on a label.
Now, Eleanor Baker would, again, thanks you for such a wonderful talk, and would like to know whether the objects you teach with can ever be used in such a way that, as they previously were, such as a sewing needle, for example, and whether the museum ever actually allows that.
That's a really interesting question, and the answer is a resounding no. However, how much here do we reveal? Let me give you an example. One of the objects which I sometimes use in teaching on the Anglo-Saxon early English literature course is a little Anglo-Saxon grooming kit that would hang from a belt by a little iron loop, and it's a little set of 3 copper alloy tools, toothpicks, and a thing for scooping the wax out of your ear. Now, those things are delicate, and they lend themselves to the kinds of touch that you would want to run that under your fingernail. And the answer is emphatically, we don't do that. And in a sense, it's not really to do with the sturdiness or otherwise of the object. It's to do with the question of how much of that any object can take before it loses something. I'm not expressing that very well. On the other hand, I was once in the stores, and this is one for Henrika, where off display at the time was our 17th century straight trumpet. And I have played that. I don't think that they would let someone come in and play the Messiah or the Allard or any of the great Amati or Stradivarius stringed instruments, but the straight trumpet can still make a sound.
Yeah, and I've heard the harpsichord actually in the
harpsichord is played. Actually, that's a really good example, Henrika. The harpsichord is tuned regularly and played regularly, and is a working, functioning instrument in the museum. And so there's your example. There's an instrument being used for exactly the purpose it was made for.
And in a way, books are also objects. And they are still read. And I've just put in the YouTube chat a plug for teaching with medieval book objects that Andrew and I are going to do tomorrow, actually. So the master students, History of the Book, have prepared new digital editions of manuscripts from Oxford collections. And we've experimented over the last term with Andrew being in the Western Library, turning pages as our remote eyes and hands looking through the volumes. Leslie has also taught this way together with Matthew Halford. And it's surprisingly deceptive, so much so that I cried out last term when one of the students on the Teams call was sipping from a coffee next to the window with a medieval manuscript, thinking, no, this can't be.
Yeah. I think the don't drink, don't point reflex is very strong in us.
Yeah.
I've been told not to point more times than I care to remember by my own doctoral supervisor, and she's dead right. And I completely understand that. Looking at the screen, seeing somebody drink, seeing somebody point, I think I would do the same thing. Andrew and Enrica, we must do something with the books in the Ashmolean. Not as old as the ones in the Bodleian, but we have some absolutely spectacular early travel books, for example, which would be worth.
Jim, can I ask you a question about the idea of curiosity? You know, because in the Middle Ages, curiositas is a vice. You know, just wanting to know for the sake of wanting to know is something that many medieval theologians really condemn, because it leads you, you know, to take your mind off more perhaps disciplined things, to use your own word, you know, a little while ago. Is there any, how would you reflect on that, I suppose, is my question. What would you say?
Well, they're wrong, obviously, aren't they? But apart from that, I would say that whereas curiositas might have been seen as a vice in theological terms, I think the evidence of the Middle Ages is that people were absolutely curious and expressed and explored and exploited their curiosity. We talked about the Valois brothers, but I mentioned Robert Grosseteste, for example. Here is a serious theologian. Here is somebody who thinks very seriously about why the world is how it is. And his explorations and his writings in light and colour, these are expressions of curiosity. I think probably Grosseteste would take me to task for suggesting that what he was doing had anything in common with that sort of vain and idle curiosity that the theologians were speaking against. But I would argue that it's a manifestation of the same impulse. And that impulse is manifest again in John Tradiscant and Elias Ashmole. So yes, I think that there were very important things to be getting on with regard to the maintenance of one's immortal soul and ensuring the eternal security of one's friends and family. But I think that pretty well everybody was a little bit curious. And I think it's there in everything that we have records of medieval people doing. It's there in Marjorie Kemp's pilgrimages. It's there in the mind of everybody who walks from Oxford to North Marston to take water from John Sean's well, or even everybody who walks from Oxford to somewhere much nearer by, you know, walks out to Botley. You are expressing curiosity in some way or other. So I think that the theologians not only wrong, but they were fighting a losing battle. And I think that the evidence of objects and of texts suggests that people weren't that fussed about worrying that curiosity was a sin, or a vice, because they were curious, like it or not.
I think you're probably exactly right on that. Thank you so much for dealing with our questions so well. I hope you'll take it as the highest compliment when I say that certainly me, and I suspect every single person who's been listening to you today now just is longing for the doors of the Ashmolean to open, because we all want to get back there to see the objects themselves in all of their glory and all of their wonder. So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah,
thank you.
Wonderful talk. Yep.
I would say this as well, that any of you out there who are at Oxford, who are interested in putting the collections to work in the service of your own curriculum, or in developing teaching of your own in the museum, then do get in touch with me, and don't wait for the museum to be open again. Because I too, like you, Leslie, long for it to be open and for these kinds of experiences to be possible once again, because our curriculum, I think, is immeasurably richer as a result of them. So thank you all very much. It's been a great pleasure and a real privilege to speak to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.